Thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I'm sure PCS requires little introduction. We're a well-known organization in the region. What's probably less well-known is the recent changes that we've undergone as an organization. Specifically, we now benefit from a global healthcare team which provides three main benefits. Firstly, that we have specialist knowledge and resource available to us. Secondly, that we have access to the best global practices and innovations in the healthcare industry. And thirdly, which I think is really, really important, is that we are advised by some of the best thought leaders in the industry and in the healthcare arena. So, introduction complete. Let's move on to today's exam question. And this is really the relationship between the healthcare facility and hospital-acquired infections or nosocomial infections, depending on which language you really like to use. So, happy to take questions at the end. Quite a bit to get through over the next 45 minutes, so I thought what might be fun to approach this in this way. So, first of all, I thought it would be useful to quickly introduce you to some of the global themes and trends that are pushing through in the healthcare arena. Secondly, we'd look at some background around HAIs, try and get a common understanding really of what we're dealing with, because for different people they mean slightly different things. Everyone in the room has a different level of experience and a perspective on nosocomial infections. I will use hospital-acquired infection and nosocomial infection interchangeably, so no one term is dominant. And thirdly, we'll have a real close look at the so what. Why should you, as FM professionals, be even the slightest bit interested in nosocomial or hospital-acquired infections? Then, fourth, we'll look at some risk activities. Who's responsible for what? What can you really get your arms around and control, and what's outside your sphere of control? And then lastly, based on global experience over 30 years, what does good look like? So what does a good holistic system for dealing with these events look like? So let's get started. We'll kick off with a global healthcare overview. So from a global perspective, healthcare continues to grow really quickly, which, seeing as it pays the salaries of just about everybody in this room, that's really good news. So, it's difficult in terms of a balancing act. The systems, the payers, the providers, everybody's looking to balance cost, quality, and access into the healthcare system. So the two new watchwords for the next 5 to 10 years are affordability and outcomes. This is really what everybody's looking at. So when we look at our global healthcare markets, they're all at different stages of evolution. And because they're all at different stages of evolution, they're all generating quite different and unique problems which are feeding into other healthcare systems such as your own. So just because it's going on in the States or going on in India or going on in Australia or Japan does not mean it's not relevant to you. So if we look at North America, unique challenges and drivers in North America. They're driven by overcapitalization, overcapacity, and a lot of inefficiency in their market. What they're looking to do is standardize and consolidate their market, and that's providing massive challenges for them. If we compare this with an emergent, developing healthcare economy, one that's really in its birth, such as Vietnam, what we're seeing there is a market that's really struggling to provide enough capacity and skills to drive the healthcare system. And then in the center, we have somewhere like the Middle East, which is challenged from both sides. So they have an interesting healthcare economy that they're building. They only want to build skill sets that are clinically relevant in terms of medicine. Everything else they want to take from somewhere else. So what that means for you is that they're an open market looking to suck all your nursing skills out and to take all your other staff out, which is going to provide massive challenges for you moving forwards. So we are looking, when we look at healthcare facilities and infection prevention and control, we're looking at a really mixed culture of practice, regulation, a lot of migration of healthcare workers from training in one environment to practicing in another. And it makes it really difficult for us as facility management professionals to work out what is the best practice and how to deliver that best practice. Now, some interesting data points on the global healthcare market for you. I'm not going to read all of this to you, it's far too much. But the big themes are this. The global healthcare market is worth about $2 trillion. It's a lot of money. So as I said before, it pays everybody's salaries in the room, so we're interested. It's very attractive. What we're tending to see globally is that because it's an attractive market that generates nice yields, nice returns, what we're seeing is a lot of hotel operators moving into this space. And there's a friend of mine that gives a lecture quite regularly, which is that a hospital is not a hotel, trying to educate this group of investors who are moving in and building facilities systems for hotels and hoping that they work for healthcare. And as you can imagine, there's a significant disconnect in that space. Now, the Asia-Pacific market is becoming dominant, and it's becoming dominant in healthcare very quickly. The point I'm going to make is that context is everything. When you have a discussion around healthcare, you have to have a discussion around context. So let's have a look at what's driving the healthcare market. Let's try and put a little bit of context around those markets and see what's moving. So when we look at the left of this slide, we look at the drivers, the trends that are pushing into our facilities. They shape the behavior of the people who own and manage the healthcare systems and the healthcare facilities. They, in turn, drive and shape the behaviors that those people, such as yourselves, that work within the four walls of those facilities. The leaders of those healthcare systems are looking to balance quality and cost, but they're also looking to enhance their own reputation. Our patients, which also includes you and your family members in this room, we're looking for safe, quality environments where we can receive health care. We want to go in feeling unwell, come out feeling better. We surely don't want to come out feeling worse than we went in. None of you would take your car to the garage so that the garage could destroy your car. It doesn't work that way. So let's have a look at some adverse events. Excuse me. Now, as you're all aware, adverse events covers a range of different bits and pieces. Slips, trips, falls, technology failures, which the chaps at ECRI can probably brief you on quite well. Breaches in confidentiality, undesirable staff interactions, which is becoming a big theme at the moment. But our interest, as I mentioned before, is around nosocomial infections. So I'll quote back to you a statement from the World Health Organization. It's less than complimentary about the global state of nosocomial infections, but let's see what you think. So, according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, despite medical and technological advances and improvements in global healthcare provision, breaches in infection control measures remain a critical issue and undermine every advance and investment in healthcare, posing a significant risk in achievement of outcomes and affordable quality healthcare. It's quite a damning statement. And the challenge is that there is no standardized approach globally as we look around the world. So clearly, quite a lot of work to do in this space, quite a lot indeed. So let's look at some numbers around nosocomial infections. The data points here are taken from mixed data sources, so you have to look at it slightly cautiously. But let's put it into perspective. First things first, is it a problem? Absolutely, yes it is. If we look at the front row in here, front row of this room, if you went into hospital, probably one of you would come out with a nosocomial infection. It's not a good outcome at the moment. Nosocomial infections prey on the most vulnerable. So patients who are in for oncology treatment turn out to be neutropenic, people who are immunosuppressed. All of these patients or are carrying some other form of disease portfolio, they're the ones that are going to suffer. And the impact can be anything from a contaminated pressure sore all the way around to full-blown septicemia. Now, there is a limited amount of published data that will provide a consistent, coherent global perspective. And depending on the state of evolution of the individual healthcare markets, you will get a different perspective as well. So the key thing is to have an identification and tracking system in place. When the WHO, for example, looks at this, they tend to take the view that there are low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries, and they take the view that there's a correlation between the level of income and the level of maturity and capability of the healthcare system. Not a true correlation, but it's good enough. So when we look at the prevalence of healthcare-associated infection, the rates vary between just under 6% and just under 20% in low and middle-income countries. If you're in a developed country, that can be as low as 7%. So it's easy to see where you'd rather be. When we look at intensive care units and we look at the acquisition of infection in those countries, it's almost 3 times higher in those low to middle-income countries than it is in the high-income countries. So ICU is a particular hotspot. The one that caught me by surprise really was the instance of nosocomial infections around people on central lines and ventilators. That can be almost 20 times higher in low to middle income countries than it is in developed countries like Europe and the USA. So a lot of work to do. Just to put some numbers around it, give you a feel really for what we're dealing with. A huge gap still exists between the knowledge that's been accumulated over the past 50 to 100 years and the implementation of infection control procedures. Around infection control, we hear a lot, people make a lot of noise about it, but not everybody's doing what needs to be done, and not everybody's doing what needs to be done in the way that it needs to be done. And that's really what we're seeing from a facilities point of view, because we have a unique perspective. We can see everybody operating in our facilities, and we can see how everybody is behaving. What I would point out is that when you are looking at poor resource settings, for this maybe think Africa, but when you're looking at those poor resource settings, having nosocomial infections is potentially disastrous, because there just isn't the depth of system to catch the failures. But in all cases, the financial consequences of hospital-acquired infections are enormous. So what I'd like to jump onto now is some interesting work that was done by Gogan 3-4 years ago. He reminds us that failure to follow evidence-based practice is tantamount to medical negligence. And he outlines 3 risk factors for acquiring an infection. He looks at patient risk factors, organizational risk factors, and iatrogenic risk factors. Iatrogenic basically means it's operator-caused. So if I was a dentist working on your tooth, if I accidentally cooked the wrong tooth, that's an iatrogenic failure. So when we look at the first one, patient risk factors, these really include things like the duration of stay, clinical setting, severity of illness. When we look at the organizational factors, which is the second one, we're really looking at the cleanliness and the hospital and treatment settings in general. So this is the stuff that we can start to influence. The filtration of the HVAC system, concentration of patient beds, pathways, process, etc., cleanliness of water systems. The iatrogenic one is really more for the clinical colleagues. Now, whilst the Gogan paper and papers like that are potentially useful from a clinical point of view, they're not really getting into the design that's associated with the facility and the materials that are relating to the facility and the processes used in the facility. So, if we start to think about things like space adjacencies, if we start to think about things like patient and staff routing, if we start to think about things like segregation, if we start to think about things like reprocessing of surgical instruments and moving those around facilities, then it starts to become a lot more real for the people in the room. I'll give you an example. We were working in Rawalpindi next to Islamabad, and we were looking to design a 50 operating room suite for the Pakistan military. And that had already been built up out of the ground by the time that we got involved. And that facility had no clean, dirty corridors. It was all on a unified corridor system. So you had to bring all the dirty waste out, move it straight through the clean corridor, past patients, past staff. And from a design point of view, you just really wouldn't tackle it like that. So, as I say, a huge gap still exists between the knowledge that's been accumulated and what people are actually doing. And that knowledge is just not being disseminated. So, I think this statement is very true. And a lot of what we're looking at around nosocomial infections is not rocket science. It's good, sensible practice that needs to be put in place and repeated in a consistent manner. So what is required here is consistent behavior by people. This is what we seek. But it's not just consistent behavior, it's appropriate behavior that's consistent. They're the two watchwords. And I must stress that when it comes to HIAs, people are the failure. It's not always the process, it's not always the techniques, it will be a breakdown in people behavior. So complacency and poor process linked to people, that's going to be a failure point. So what do we do about it? How do we create a safe environment for patients, staff, visitors? How do we make sure that our behaviors today don't create a problem for those who follow us tomorrow? So I was at a briefing last week in London from the Royal College of Nursing, from the Deputy Chief Exec, Rose Gallagher, and we were looking at what the future of infection control looked like. And she was quite blunt. She said that we're at a tipping point. MRSA was interesting, single strain, single resistance to one compound, but she said that what she was really scared about was the new organisms, the CREs, the carbapenem-resistant organisms. And what she was saying is that those particular species are now resistant to the strongest antibiotics that we have. There's nowhere else to go. If you catch one of those, that's it. And she viewed that as an infection control professional, she viewed that as terrifying. But it's coming. So there's a lot of work in this space and a lot of changes that need to be made. So the future of infection control is going to resolve around some very nasty gram-negative organizations, which will go under the banner of CREs. Anyway, stories aside, let's keep moving. Now, although we've made a lot of progress around the world in terms of HIIs and how we behave with them and they behave with us, there are probably 5 big drivers here on the screen. If you add to these the rise in antimicrobial resistance, such as what we've just mentioned around CREs and MRSA, it's a really interesting and dynamic landscape that we have to get our arms around. So, if you think about it, we're really positioning for that perfect storm. Whereas on one side, you've got massive antimicrobial resistance, and on the other side, you've got lack of consistent process and quality of delivery of IPC programs. So, major challenges. So, poor and inconsistent process, virulent pathogens, major resistance, complacency, because we've never had one, so we'll probably never get one. So does it really matter if we really don't do everything as well as we could do? Well, yes, it does. And there are plenty of stories from around the world of people who've been complacent on a facility level and been caught out really, really badly. So there's also a lack of a standardized approach and variable compliance. So even if you have a process, is the process being executed cleanly and consistently? And a lot of the time, the answer is not. So I would argue, that infection prevention and control is like quality, and it's everybody's responsibility. So let's have a look at global best practice and guidelines. So if we look for a consistent approach, then again, a good place to look is the WHO. The WHO has really taken this issue to task more from developing and quasi-developed markets than developed markets, but they've built some good processes around this, and they've provided some really good insight that's genuinely helpful. So the core components of a good infection prevention and control program looks at both the national level and down to the facility level. And the key part of those WHO strategies is to be able to prevent and contain current and future threats. It's to strengthen the resilience of the healthcare system, and it's also to put measures in place to combat the antimicrobial resistance. There's not an awful lot that people in this room can do to deal with the AMRs, the antimicrobial resistance. There's not much we can do. But there is a lot we can do on the other aspects. And also to provide support for countries to develop national protocols, so that's fully available to the whole of the Southeast Asia region, and to develop and support healthcare facility processes and protocols to eliminate or limit issues around infection control. So the WHO guidelines really are the first evidence-based guidelines and recommendations for executing an IPC program. If you look at what's also following hot on the heels of this, I'm sure some of you in the room will be familiar with an American organization called ASHE, A-S-H-E. They also are issuing some interesting papers at the moment around this topic as well. So you'd be well advised to follow up from this discussion with those papers. Now, in terms of the programs are structured to deliver best practice in a global network, and then they're also designed to provide guidelines as to how to put in place a robust IPC program. And then there's the infection prevention and control education and training that's required to get successful implementation. If you don't have a clear plan as to how you're going to deliver this, it's probably not likely to happen. And then the last bit, which is really quite important, is surveillance. Making sure that we're constantly monitoring both the facility and the people in the facility to see which infections are on our radar at this particular moment in time. Now, there's a lot of talk around multimodal strategies, and there's a lot of talk around single-mode strategies. If I give you our opinion, a multimodal strategy, which is employing many different approaches to infection prevention and control, is much more effective and important than a single modal strategy. For me, single modal strategies are great for communication campaigns and raising awareness and education. They're not great for operational efficacy. And then finally, we need the monitoring and audit of IPC practices to make sure that we're defining what we measure, that we're managing what we're measuring, and that we're taking the right corrective action. So if we look at the top level, the national level, to get a holistic approach, this is a nice model to work with. The point here is that nosocomial infections are not just an issue for local healthcare providers or local healthcare facility owners. They're the responsibility of a system. So not the facility, not the individual, not the FM manager, not the cleaning leader. They can't be fixed with a single piece of technology. They really represent a complex ecosystem with a lot of players, a lot of actors all playing into one space. So the best way to think of this really is a system of systems. So if you have a good infection prevention and control measure, then really you're dealing with that system of systems, and that's what we're looking at here. So national leadership, direction, governance, critically investment, and a commitment to improve is vital, especially when we're looking at some of the more rural areas. So, what's the role? Where do you fit into the system of systems? What is, to ask a really blunt question, what is your role and influence in the world of infection prevention and control? So when we look at the nosocomial infections, they're unnecessary adverse events, largely preventable, not absolutely, but largely preventable. And assuming that we deploy that system of systems, which is focused on suitable and proper facility design, suitable and proper healthcare worker behavior, and that we have compliance with evidence-based infection prevention procedures and guidelines, then we've got a foundation of a robust system which potentially will deliver sustainable outcomes, which is really what we're looking for. So whether or not it's placing whether or not it's from placing hand sanitizers for optimal use or looking at the whole water management system, the physical environment plays really a super important role in infection prevention and control. It is that intersection between clinical and non-clinical activities that is key to success. So for us as FM professionals, we need strong partnerships to improve outcomes and to keep patients safe. And for clinicians to say it's nothing to do with us is wrong. For nursing staff to say it's nothing to do with us is wrong. So there needs to be broader engagement and a broader understanding that everybody brings a perspective. So infection control and prevention is the responsibility of everyone in the facility, from surgeons, porters, patients, and down to the visitors themselves. Without clear and consistent communication, it's too easy for this network of people to forget their responsibilities to one another and to the system. And when you don't have an ongoing event, the urgency seems to drift away. So you need to keep the momentum, keep the noise, keep the communication. I would argue it's the job of the FM manager to keep those lines of communication open, to keep that level of urgency and understanding active, and this is done with regular meetings, spot checks, training sessions, a really robust team spirit between both the healthcare providers and the support services providers. Doesn't matter if it's outsourced, insourced, or however it's constructed. You have to have those open and respectful communication channels. Now, it's a balancing act to manage the risks of HIAs. So, again, I would argue facility managers need to assess and understand the infection risks and to establish programs to mitigate those risks effectively. To do this, there's a really good toolbox available to you, which runs from facility condition surveys, asset inspections, risk assessments, risk registers, operational risk tracking, both on the clinical and the non-clinical side, multidisciplinary committee formations to look at this, many different tools available to you. But I would repeat again, it's the collaboration and cooperation between the clinical and non-clinical practices that will deliver success in this space. Programs and processes will require time and resource to develop and to maintain and to keep running. But honestly, they are well worth the time, effort, energy that you're going to put into this. Nobody really wants to be the person that was responsible for having a rampant nosocomial infection in their facility. The cost of failure in this space is ferocious, it's unlimited, and again, the media is these cases are well documented in both the professional and the public media. Now, as FM colleagues, the need is to focus on what can be controlled in the facility, but also to influence what we can't control. So there's a good understanding here from a risk management point of view. What can we control? What can we not control? What we can't control, we can't really change, but we can position ourselves to respond against it, and we might also be able to influence it. So that success is going to come from a multidisciplinary approach. And it starts from when the facility is a concept on a piece of paper, and it continues until after the facility is decommissioned. So just as with the new construction, infection prevention staff should be part of the planning team. And in some of the best design teams I've worked on over the years, you have an IPC nurse on there who's advising to the design team. And it produces some really interesting effects. And to be honest, it's a lot easier to modify a facility with a pencil than it is to use a jackhammer. Now, if we consider designing isolation rooms, then the way in which patients enter, the way in which patients leave, the way in which airflow moves in and out, all of these things are potentially really important. So using human factors engineering methods to analyze tasks that are performed in existing spaces, we ask what design features are likely to contribute to the lack of compliance. So it's really looking for failures. Where is this system going to break? So working with healthcare professionals to design spaces and systems that support efficient workflows for those professionals to enable them to access clean supplies while still protecting clean and sterile supplies from contamination is really quite important, so that we get that separation of clean, dirty, and that we don't get that cross-contamination. When you look at this from a cleaning point of view, we have some microfiber cloths on the booths outside, and you should perhaps go and grab one as well. But far too often I see people using the same cloth and moving it from a washroom to a kitchen to a patient area. This is just fundamentally wrong, and it's down to a lack of education. So having the right technology is not always the right answer. You've got to have the right sustaining process, the right education that goes with it. Now, if we look at areas, for example, that are designed to control airborne contaminants, ensuring that that HVAC system provides appropriate pressure relationships and the air exchange rates and temperature and relative humidity, all super important. One of the ones which was a bit of a surprise to me, maybe not to you, was actually receiving goods in to a facility and making sure that those goods in are unpacked well away from clinical areas. It's an interesting observation, perhaps one I should have learned from in my time in Pakistan, but that's really quite key. So if you are receiving deliveries, then they should be unpacked in goods in, not as they approach clinical spaces. Now, so here we are. The top 5 infection risks in a healthcare facility. First thing is, the infection risk can be airborne. It's not always physical. If you ask people about infection, they seem to assume that it's person to person. If you pushed me for a 6th one, I would probably say that one of the biggest risks here is around reprocessing and reprovisioning. So what's generally referred to as CSSD, which is clinical sterile supplies, and theatre sterile supplies, taking the dirty instruments out and bringing the dirty instruments for cleaning and repatriating clean instruments. But every facility is different. I would argue that no one facility and no one person or one authority has all the answers. There is a lot of best practice out there, a lot. But a word of warning, best practice drives reputation. Failure to follow best practice means that you're exposed, and then that becomes almost a business killing risk. Your hospital is on the front page of the paper, you have no defense. There is a huge amount of work going on in this space. A lot of investment to establish best practice. It's not just the World Health Organization. I've already mentioned ASHE. There's a group of 12 academic medical centers in the USA, all looking at the next generation of techniques to deal with nosocomial infections. As healthcare services providers, we're aligned to all of these people. And as a service provider to the healthcare space, we're advised by them, we follow their guidance very closely. So the way in which we deliver our services is perfectly aligned. There's still plenty of scope from what's already published to do a lot better in this space, as well as dealing with the new guidance that will come tomorrow. So what I'm going to introduce you to now is an example of a national system and how it dovetails down to a local level. There's a lot here, okay? I'm not going to go through all the detail. I thought perhaps we'd have time. We don't. So I mentioned we're dealing with a system of systems. So when we look at that system of systems, what does it look like? Well, at the top, you've got the national statute, which is law. This is what you must do in this healthcare space. Some countries have that, some countries don't. And that law defines the systems, the appropriate environments, the appropriate use of antimicrobials, the delivery of accurate information, the identification of the responsible person, and that it also mandates that all healthcare workers should be trained. So everything that we've discussed so far is encapsulated into law. And then that's followed by clear guidance around how these services should be delivered. And this is when you get NICE cuts in for the NHS. And that's much more practical advice. This is how you do it on a day-to-day basis. And then you also need a policeman, an auditor to go with that, and that is the role of the Care Quality Commission. They will go around and inspect facilities just in the same way that JCI will go around and inspect facilities and make sure that you're compliant. So to have services designed to be delivered that are compliant with the regulator's requirements is really quite important. And then finally, you need an organization that sits around that system that really is focused on education, empowerment, and creating surveillance systems to monitor for those potential breaches and which pathogens are evolving at any moment in time. So that's what a system of systems looks like. It's just a convenience example. It's from the UK. We could have used Ireland. We could have used Canada or America. They have equally good systems. So let's get in at a local level. So a local program is really focused on defining a system and defining behaviors and driving communication campaigns to reinforce really what's been learned or forgotten. And this is a big issue. People choose to forget. And a lot of the local campaigns are around reinforcing with existing healthcare workers what the expectation of the healthcare organization is. And this really, for me, is a big role for the facilities community. The Royal College of Nursing has a great campaign at the moment. So this is the London Royal College of Nursing, and it's called their Small Changes campaign. It's small changes make a big difference. So what is your role in this? It might be really small, but it's going to make a big difference to the potential outcome. So that Small Changes campaign has worked really, really well for them. So collecting those local data points that feed into that national and subnational system is really important, because if you don't know what you're dealing with and you don't know which pathogens are becoming more virulent, you really don't know what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So here's an interesting question. What's the role of innovation in these systems, be that either globally, nationally, or locally? So remember, our goal is to create salogenic environments. That really defines as being safe, healing environments. That is our role as healthcare facilities management professionals. So my first point is this. We develop design strategies that are intended to prevent the transmission of infection when building or renovating healthcare facilities. And that requires a fundamental understanding of how infections are spread in a healthcare facility. Secondly, there has to be a robust knowledge of local regulatory requirements and an understanding of published and new innovative best practices for infection prevention as they relate to the built environment, plus where that information can be found. And again, I would point you to the new publication by Ashe that came out 2 weeks ago. Really, really robust, well-designed guidance that can be implemented. Technology. My view on technology is it's there to enable a process. It is not the answer. So whatever process you design, the technology is designed to support the process. And then finally, engagement. The design and construction planning phase requires both the multidisciplinary teamwork that we've spoken about and a commitment by leadership to assure the incorporation of best practices for both new and renovated spaces. A lot of the time, we forget the infection control agenda when we're dealing with renovated spaces. We focus on it for new spaces, but not for renovated. Now, if we have a quick look at water management. Water management really shows how effective a simple program can be, but equally it shows just how disastrous a failure can be. To date, there is really excellent guidance, excellent control systems, and good education around water management systems in healthcare facilities. So why have we got people dying? Why have we got massive fines in play in this space? It's all preventable. So why? And again, it comes back to the weak point in the system, and the weak point in the system is the people. It's the behaviors, the complacency, the lack of education, and the process. In this case, you have to argue the process is there, so even more so it focuses on the people. Cleaning. All of the items on this slide are key aspects of infection prevention and control. If we can do nothing else but make sure that these 5 aspects are delivered consistently in an appropriate way, we will make a huge impact. These are the basic foundations of success. Not very sexy, not very flashy, but they're really, really important. And if we fail to complete these, then disaster will visit. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will certainly make an appearance. Now, ask yourself this question. In a healthcare facility, how often have you seen a healthcare cleaning professional not following one of these? You don't need to answer, just need to think about it. So I'll leave that one with you. Innovations in infection prevention and control. So let's put this into perspective, because again, context is everything. So the growing concern over the use of antimicrobials and how they drive that resistance profile. Add to that the fact that healthcare is genuinely cautious in adopting new technologies. We are, as a community, we don't race into things. We're quite slow and thoughtful and methodical about how we engage with new technologies. But there are some really good inventions and some really good technologies and innovations that are coming through. They're not a substitute for a robust environmental program and a robust engineering program and a robust design program. They're a complement and things to consider. So, first of all, you've got UVC. Really quite interesting. Great for decontaminations, but if you have a shadow, you have no decontamination. And then we look at the fogging systems, things like hydrogen peroxide. You can biodecontaminate an area, but you have to wait before you can get back into it. So it depends what you're dealing with. And then we have a range of different chemicals as well, and different nurses have different views on which chemicals should be used. Some people like no chemicals, some people like quite harsh chemicals, and everything in between. One of the more interesting innovations has been the composite surfaces. And these are surfaces that are impregnated and either resist the attachment of microbes or are active in taking on either a bacteriostatic or bactericidal perspective. And you could take the same approach with both fungi and viruses as well. So, some interesting innovations there for you. Now, in terms of moving to the close, we've spoken about a system of systems. That system of systems is the most effective framework to deliver an effective infection prevention and control program from a global stage down to a patient room. So I thought it might be worthwhile just to take a minute and look at what would actually make that happen and what that might look like when it's actually working. So the slide provides a good summary of the factors that will enable successes at a facilities level. So on the left-hand side, really it's moving from law, statute, and then moving all the way across to what good looks like, what the day-to-day activities look like on the right-hand side. Again, to make this work and to keep this working, it's all around communication and engagement for that ecosystem that makes up your facility. So I'm not a fan of animations, I apologize for that. So to close the session, let's go all the way back to the beginning. So what the healthcare providers and what the healthcare payers, who are the people that pay for the healthcare system, be they either insurers or government or individuals, they want a manageable cost. They want something that's affordable to them. They want relevant quality with definable outcomes, meaningful outcomes. So our role in this is to create and manage a safe working environment, both for patients, staff, and visitors. The enemy to that process are the people that exist in that system and their behaviors. The complacency that sometimes they bring with them, the lack of education on the part of the healthcare provider, and the lack of process on the part of the healthcare provider. So, let's go back to the exam question. What is your role in this whole process? Well, in short, you are key to the outcome of this. You own the agenda, you drive the communication, you drive the engagement, and you champion the outcomes. So, honestly, it's all about you. Thank you.